Are you experiencing turnover in your fund development? There are steps that if you enact right now, organizations can take to be more proactive in their approach to avoiding staff turnover.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Coffee Time with Masterminds. My name is Peter Blakely, and I'm the founder and principal of Blakely Consulting.
Welcome to Coffee Time with Masterminds. I am Cynthia Rojas, founder and principal of To Your Growth.
Welcome to Coffee Time with Masterminds. I'm Rebecca Tuttle, founder and principal of Grant Right Now and Grant Writing for Good. Welcome to episode 107 of Coffee Time with Masterminds. Whether you're a leader of a mission-based organization in the US or Australia, today's episode is just for you. I want to welcome my two colleagues to the show, Cynthia Rojas and Peter Blakely. Good morning.
Good morning.
Hi, Peter.
Good to see you.
Nice to see you too. Every time I make mention that we're syndicated in Australia, I think, wow, that's such an achievement and it's so exciting.
107 episodes is quite an achievement too.
I know.
Stuck with it through a lot.
Absolutely. And we get a lot of engagement on our show. So don't be shy if it's your first time with us today. Pop your name in the comments and let us know where you're from and ask questions as we go throughout because we have a great show planned for you today.
Yeah, this is going to be a really interesting topic.
So today we're talking about staff turnover and fund development and what organizations can do to avoid that turnover. A lot of proactive steps. But before we dive in, Cynthia, I wanted to ask you a question. What can organizations do to avoid turnover in their development teams? And how that relates to the effects of turnover in the workplace. So before we answer the question about what can we do, I thought it'd be great to talk about the impact or the effects of turnover in the workplace.
I think that's a great question, Rebecca. There are a lot of impacts when your staff leave. And one is institutional knowledge. They take their knowledge with them. Unless you are an organization that has a strong knowledge management system, now we've had episodes about that. So if you're great at documenting and having really good notes, then that's less disruptive. But many nonprofits are already under-resourced. And so they lose the knowledge. It also impacts morale. Every time somebody leaves, you have to realize that people are staying behind and what that does to how they feel. And if you have too many people leave, then it really starts to impact those that stay behind. And every time we would have turnover at the organization I worked at, I would talk about, let's meet with the staff who are staying behind to make sure that they are okay and not make it a mystery. But fund development is really interesting because a lot of times the goal is also to raise money and their benchmarks are associated to dollar amounts. And in fund development, Rebecca, you know that there's a lot more that has to happen before we can raise that money. And so being very careful about the benchmarks you set, because it can be very stressful for fund development individuals.
We've talked so much in the last year or so about how stressed everybody is, right? How throughout the organization, everybody has lived through a significant trauma, at least one, right? And all of these other things are going on. And the organization is stressed. And I imagine that we don't have enough money is really a lightning rod in organizations. We can't do that because we haven't got the money, right? So the development staff must be feeling especially pressured to do more with less, right? Yeah. All of that. It's a hard time.
I equate it to being thrown in a piranha tank, especially if you're new. I didn't have any formal training whatsoever. It actually didn't exist when I started out. And, I had a lot of doors closed and, because there's also a lot of competition. So I thought, well, here I am, eager and young to get into the workforce, and no one really wants to help me. So what am I going to do? I could give up and retreat, or I can figure out a way to make it work. And to this day, I still use those same templates that I created to help me get out of that prana tank.
And that is one area where there are always jobs available. So, right, you're going to get a lot of people who don't have a ton of experience in those jobs, and then they need more support than organizations might be able to give them.
Absolutely.
Rebecca, you've been in this field a long time, and tell me your thoughts about this. But one of the things so I used to run the fundraising development department, and I did that for 5 years. And one thing that was very clear to me is that your director of development within a nonprofit organization should be the right-hand person to the executive director or CEO, because the relationships need cultivating. The leader needs to be a part of the process. And if your development staff are isolated and not really in partnership with the leader of the organization, it makes for a rocky relationship internally. Do you find that in your work?
Well, I'm on the consulting side now, so it was different when I was a development director, development manager. And I also think it's really important to point out that fund development as a whole has different facets. So there is a development director who's responsible for the department, but within that, you might have development managers who manage the activities of the department to assist the development director. You have those who go out and they focus solely on donor relations and community engagement. And then you might have the grant writing team. So the grant writer doesn't always do fundraising and fund development. Everyone has to work together. So when there's a lot of pressure within the team to perform, that trickles up to a lot of pressure for that development executive to perform and to show results. And when there isn't a lot of communication within the team, like, hey, this grant wasn't received, or this donor decided to give elsewhere this time. If you don't have those open and transparent conversations, it can cause a lot of, I guess you could say, ruckus in the team. And then you're not going to meet those performance standards. And that's where you see some of that penalization come through. And then people sort of retreat before it gets worse. And so when I was in those roles, I always made it a point to be communicative and really to try and enact some of the 3 steps that we're going to be talking about today. And I have seen that in other organizations as well.
Yeah, that partnership is essential, right? If your fundraising department is operating like a department, like a siloed department, it just creates more pressure and stress.
And the alignment between development and programs has to be there, right? We talked so much about how when development is off getting money, and then the programs are trying to design programs to match the money that they got, how that contributes to mission creep, ends up with organizations spread too thin, ends up with, logic models that don't make sense, all of that. So, tighter communication, right? Having development that's really, really based on what this organization does and its strengths and how its programs work is really important.
And letting go of programs if they no longer serve the community, or if your community's grown out of them, and bringing about new. There are so many new initiatives that organizations have taken on since COVID became a pandemic, that some things that we used to do, we talk about this in quite a few episodes, are either no longer, or the organizations had to adapt. And with that, you also have to adapt to outreaching to new sources of funding, new donors, new stakeholder engagement.
Yeah.
And Rebecca, I want to say this because I think it's really important. I meet a lot of development individuals or people in that industry who would tell me, they don't know everyone in the organization, or they don't attend program or other department meetings, or they may not know the details of the programs. And for me, that's just unacceptable. A big part of the work is also really deeply understanding what is happening on the ground level with the programs, and not just high level. And so a lot of times when I work with an organization, I actually have to bridge that gap because I find it to be wide sometimes. And so I think that, and I don't want to add pressure to development individuals, but I think it's important for them to really gain a deep knowledge of what's going on in the organization.
You're absolutely right. And I think there's a craving to be able to do so. Understanding, you have to understand every department within your organization really to perform to the standards that your organization has set for you in your role, raising funds, engaging donors, stewarding the community. And if you don't have access to that information or the ability to establish those connections and relationships internally, it only damages the external partnerships that you could establish. And where we find a lot of conflict in organizations is, well, whose responsibility is it to reach out to that high level donor or stakeholder? Is it appropriate, right, for that development staff person, team member, to do that outreach, or that's something that the CEO would rather do? I believe that they should be communicating always together to either make those appointments, introductions as a whole, or, you know, tag teaming each other to go and do these things. Because the representation for who's the face of the organization, I mean, I think if COVID has taught us anything, it's that doesn't exist anymore. Everyone represents your organization, at least from the standpoint of our show, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, that's really key. That's really key.
So I wanted to now turn over to PETA and talk about staff turnover isn't necessarily something that happens overnight. I love my job today, but I want to leave it tomorrow,
Yeah.
Granted that some people do, in fact, make transitions onward and upward through their jobs, but there is feedback that we as organizations can collect and analyze to help avoid some of that turnover. Would you mind sharing your thoughts on that?
And so many organizations don't start gathering feedback until they suspect that there's a problem. So, right, what I'm constantly recommending if people do want to gather feedback from their staff is make it frequent and short. Don't, every year or 2 or 5 distribute a half-hour survey. Let's just do quick pulse checks. That's going to be a lot more useful. And let's measure things that matter to us. I talked to somebody yesterday. Oh, my organization did an employee survey of engagement. And I said, well, how did they measure engagement? And he's like, oh, whatever the consultants told them. Like, it wasn't really meaningful in our organization. It wasn't really what we think it looks like when we're engaged, right? So, let's think about things like, are people showing up? Do people come to the company cookout? Are people responding to emails? Do people seem informed and excited? Can people say what is going on in other departments and how their work is supporting it? Can people say how their work supports the organization's mission? Do people, here is a big one, do people respect and trust their manager? Feel like they can go to their manager for support?
That's the big one.
So all of these little things. And
that's especially huge, PETA, because if you can't respect and feel as your manager is approachable, that's when organization team members trip up. I can't tell my boss we didn't get that grant or that donor.
Or I don't know how to do this. Right. And then something else in the area of development is, we look at, that is one area that is especially prone to only looking at that one outcome metric, which is how much money did we get? And here's a department where you absolutely don't want to do that, right? Where, you could bring in, like Rebecca has said so many times, so what if you brought in $1 million this year? If it wasn't consistent with your growth plan, if you're not going to be able to build on that next year, it might have done you more harm than good. Right. So we really want to be focusing on like what are measures of on trackness with our development plan, right? And can we track things like, you know, how many times did we reach out to funders and have conversations with them? How many grants did we look at and realize we weren't the best fit, but we helped one of our neighbors get it? Wouldn't that be an amazing
I
metric
love
to
it.
track? How many applications did we put in? How many applications did we get feedback on? How many applications do we have like all of the right players at the table when we wrote it? All those kinds of things are really important to be looking at, because we want to be looking at how the organization is supporting and aligning with our development efforts, not just how much money we got in the end.
Yeah, I want to add something, Peter, that you mentioned about surveying staff. In previous episodes, especially when we were knee deep in the pandemic crisis, we had recommended that you survey your staff every 6 months.
Yeah.
And that happens more frequently because of the impact that the pandemic was having on individuals. And even though many organizations now have settled into a new way of working, I think we are still recommending that we do it twice a year. And more if you could do a 5-question or 2-question pulse check, but really keeping tabs on how your staff are doing is essential, because I talk to leaders all day and I have to tell you, there are many of them that are still going through the crisis. They're still in a crisis mode. So it's important to check in with your staff.
And this crisis mode is not going away for a while, right?
Yeah.
I mean, this is, what we have learned through COVID is managing through COVID was just the future of management. We managing through uncertain and unsettled times for the near future. And also that all of the things that are good practices in an uncertain and an unsettled time are just the good practices, right? So let's just assume, like, if it was a good idea to survey your staff at least every 6 months during COVID, I would say right now, actually, probably more frequently than that. Because honestly, the turnover is creating so much additional stress in your organization. If you want to know about that, with the caveat, don't ask about things you can't fix, right? So, don't, if you know that you don't have the budget to distribute raises, like, let's not ask people how important it is to them to get a raise, right? That kind of thing. So, but
communicate
that. Do ask for honest feedback, right? And do ask what would make your job easier to the extent that you can do it.
Yeah. I love that.
This is great. This is a great discussion. All right. Do you want to jump in now to the 3 tips for avoiding staff turnover?
Yeah.
All right.
I love tips.
Well, the first one really has to do with culture. We've spoken in previous episodes, and we have plans for additional episodes all about workplace culture. Creating an organizational culture that supports diversity, equity, and inclusion is really, really essential. And if you don't know what DE&I or diversity, equity, and inclusion is, there are tremendous consultants out there. There's literature, books you can read. You really need to take the first step in all of this and have some support around DE&I, helping to create an environment within your organization that ensures that your teammates feel welcome as well as appreciated. That's the first step, really, is the culture. How do people feel within your organization? Are they part of the team? Can they vocalize their successes, but also their struggles? And do you have the supports in place to steward, just as you're doing with donors, to steward your team members forward towards success in their role?
Yeah. And you made a really, really interesting point about diversity in the development team specifically before we came on air. Can you repeat that, Rebecca? Do you remember what I'm talking about?
No.
So your comment was about that people in marginalized communities might not have access to training and education.
Oh, yes.
Right, in the field of development specifically. And so, how can we think about providing additional support to make sure that the people who are doing that work and the people in marginalized communities are accessing those resources?
That's right. We were talking about that. It's really important because in marginalized communities, oftentimes resources are thin. They're so much thinner than more affluent communities. And that's not to say, though, that the donors and the stakeholders in those communities don't have resources to support organizations. They are certainly resource plenty in a lot of areas, but it's providing the support to the marginalized communities to be able to make themselves enough known to draw the attention of those who can support and elevate the activities of that organization. That being said, if you are starting a development department within your organization and you're bringing in more diversity into that role, more support in that area, you also have to realize that some development team members may not come equipped with the same level of skill or knowledge or experience that other organizations that maybe have more resources do, to be able to hire whole teams, right? It could just be one person doing everything, and that's part of their job. And so organizations really need to focus on in underserved communities is that their development department and teammates may struggle, and they may struggle a lot, but it's our responsibility as an organization to help them through that struggle and support them with some of that lack of resources. And also to partner, as you had said earlier, Cynthia, within the organization to help that team member gain that exposure to the community that really they're kind of on their own trying to do. And it's a struggle, but we don't want that for them, because then that's when you see that turnover.
I'll tell you where I've seen diversity become an issue and really needs to be focused on is there are legacy or really highly experienced development individuals who have a model that has been used for centuries. And then you have the younger generation who voted in President Obama $20 at a time, right? And for an organization shifting to online fundraising or different ways to fundraise versus the way that fundraising was very popular is that you focus on your major donors. You took them out to lunch. You brought them in during events. You highlighted them. You build a park in their name. And so we have a generation that has moved away from that thinking and really looking to redefine fundraising. And so when you think about diversity, I think that's essential. Allowing the generation that is redefining fund development to be included in conversations, and let's listen to them. Let's look at how they see fundraising today. Again, they voted in a president $20 at a time,
Yeah.
so they know something.
I mean, the field of philanthropy is changing.
Yes,
needs to change. Yeah.
yeah.
I was going to say that in some regards, philanthropists are actually doing this work for us by changing the way that they give, the way that they think about giving, that they're really requiring that the suits, remember we talked about the suits, move over so that they can gain a wider lens exposure to what's going on in the community, who at your organization is making sure that your community is represented, and how are you doing boots on the ground work. It's no longer we have this grand idea and we have this grand research plan and it's all scientific and sophisticated, and then we'll deliver on that and all will be well. That's what grants used to be, right? In some regards they still are, but now it's I want to see your community. I want to envision as if I'm there. And many funders are actually visiting the community and going in and saying, we will only fund this now because this is what we see is important. And I've seen such transition that if you're not on board with that transition, if that's out of your comfort zone as an organization, then you're going to miss a lot of funding opportunities because funding is different now.
Yeah.
It's really fundamentally changed. I want to make sure that we get to talk about number 2 and number 3.
Okay,
Yeah,
no pun intended, Peter. Okay, let's move in. So number 2 is skilling up and skilling over. We talked about this, so we don't have to go too detailed, but tapping into your team's talents and skills is really important. What are they good at? Where do they excel? And how can you as an organization support further development in their skill set? Do your team members, based on the feedback that you may have received, do they have an interest in another role within your department, in a higher responsibility and development? And we should really be supporting that, because what we don't want are team members who aren't happy in their position, who might need some help with education. And that's why I always, in my consulting, I coach, I write, and I teach, because it's all encompassing of building up people's confidence in being able to perform in this role.
And we can't, we can't afford to just lose people from the organization at this point. I went to a meeting yesterday at my local chamber of commerce. They were saying, for the first time that they can remember, there just aren't enough workers. We can't afford for anybody to be leaving our organization or to be, stepping out of the workforce, which means if somebody is in a job that they're underskilled for or not supported in, you really cannot risk that they just find a job in a different organization, right? You've got to either support them to stay in the job that they're in, or help them find a job within your organization that better suits their interests and their skills and your ability to support them, right? But we can't just let people leave and go do something else. We can't afford it at this point.
Yeah.
And when that person leaves your organization, you lose a little bit of institutional knowledge. You're better off keeping them and having them in a different department than losing them altogether.
And it widens your gap in your ability to continue funding and also to raise funding, because the training is so heavy within this. And oftentimes, again, organizations don't have the resources. So sometimes their teammates feel like they're being thrown in that piranha tank, and it's our job to help them not feel that way.
Yeah, how scary must that be to be in development? You're out there on your own, interacting with funders and donors, and if you don't feel like your organization has your back, that must be really terrifying.
The third point is mentoring. Mentor. And the mentor for your development team may not be you as the leadership of the organization. I often think that we find the most help when our development mentor does not work within our organization, to help that development team member feel more comfortable speaking freely about some of the challenges within the organization that they're facing in their role, if that's the case. But being a mentor, and if you're not able to provide a mentor within your organization and you support that external mentoring component, then creating a space for that mentee to have time to be able to focus on that mentoring experience, but also widening your network within the organization to connect your development team members to a mentor is really important.
That is such a great idea to use mentors outside of the organization. And I don't think we think about that enough.
I think we could bring in someone to talk about mentoring. I'm big on mentoring. And I think about it a lot, because as I think about my own personal legacy, right, and the knowledge I have in my head, how do I begin to impart some of this experience and knowledge to others? And yet I find professionals turned off by mentoring. And so I see, and the most reported reason is because mentees don't take the relationship seriously. So I do want to put some of that on mentees. But I do want to say it is our responsibility as leaders to impart this knowledge. And mentorship and sponsorship is the number one way to upward mobility within an organization or within a company. And so if you really want to help people rise to their own leadership, mentor them. And I think we should do an episode because we don't talk about mentorship. And I think it's really important. And remember, we have a lot of EDs retiring. And if younger people have not been mentored, we're going to have a problem. I'm over time, so I'm going to stop talking before Rebecca yells at me.
But I agree with you. We need to do a show about that.
Yeah.
I love my mentor. And in fact, I just met her 8 months ago,
Yeah.
And she's amazing. And maybe she could come on our show. She's in.
Oh, that'd be great.
Mm-hmm. All right. Great. Well, any key takeaways before we leave for the Friday weekend?
I think my big takeaway is, as scary. We have talked about what a weird and scary and unsettled time it is for the entire organization and for the staff. Development are out there in a lot of ways on the front lines. And any of the uncertainty, poor management, poorly defined objectives, unclear metrics, lack of organizational structure that's going on inside is going to be magnified for them. So it's really important to think about how do we strengthen the entire team, and then how do we support them appropriately.
Yeah. I think really partner with your development team and really make them part of the organization. They should be embedded. Everyone should know who they are, and they should know who everyone else is.
Yeah.
Mm. And this no secret that this is hard work. This is very hard work. It's scary. I call funders all the time, and I still have to prepare for that conversation and coach my clients through that conversation. It's not that it doesn't get easier. It does get easier as you skill up in the role, but you're always going to face situations that you may feel intimidated reaching out or discouraged if you get a declination. There's that, I believe, is a sign of a funder saying, this is not a right fit and you need to find a fit elsewhere. And so taking that information, saying, okay, where else can we go to learn, practice, or outreach? And those are the 3 components that I focus on in my role as a development professional. And don't be afraid. Just back up and take your time. That's all, that's all you can do.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Rebecca. This has been a really great show.
Yeah. Thank you. Have a great weekend, everyone.
Have a great weekend, everybody.
Bye.